Jemele Hill, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
It's so good to have you here. There is so much to dig into. How you are one of the most outspoken and I would say direct journalists and commentators out there today. How you use your platform in meaningful ways. All the work you're doing with the podcast, with your production company, and of course your upcoming memoir, Uphill. But before we get into all of that, before we get into all the good stuff that you're doing, I have a slightly different question, slightly off topic, but I need you to think carefully before you answer because it could impact how I spend my holidays. You and Van Latham had a whole podcast on The Wire, which I haven't seen. So I'm going to, see, I need you to think carefully before you hold it together. I'm going to need you to tell me what I'm missing here.
So I think the Wire is the best television drama of all time, and I think there's a lot of it that appeals to me. One, it was written by actual journalist David Simon, who spent many years covering the police for the Baltimore Sun. So the depth and the layers in this story are meant to not really make anybody a hero or necessarily a complete villain. He's telling the story of an inner city, why it's in decline, why we have these malfunctioning systems, because they're all a part of a wider system that just doesn't work for people. So I grew up in inner city Detroit, and whether you're from Detroit, LA, Chicago, New York, any of these cities where you see very similar things, he sort of explains the decline of the American urban city through one series. And that's why every year or every season focuses on a different element. So season 2 is about really the decline of industrialization and how that impacted urban cities. Then you have a focus on education in season 4. It's like in season 5.
This is deep.
It's the failure of the media.
Yeah.
No, it's very deep. And then the examination of the drug trade in season 1. And the examination of the drug trade, period, and how it touches everything is prevalent throughout. That's the underlying through line. But then you also have an examination about how local city politics is completely corrupt. And it's also a part of this overall failure. So he explains so much about the decline of great cities that's why I consider this to be the ultimate masterpiece in television writing, to explain how systems malfunction and ultimately do not serve people in our country. So my advice,
okay, here we go.
Get on this immediately. It's never too late with The Wire, because it rings even truer today than it did when it came out. Like, it was truly ahead of its time. And now I think as we see how decline has impacted America, that this is a city to which they see something so much wider and broader than just a television series. So that's my pitch for to watch The Wire.
you knocked it out of the park. I'm going to watch it. You have now, how many seasons?
It's 5 seasons.
Okay, you now shaped my holidays. I shall be watching this, and I'll send you a book report. You
Please.
Are from Detroit.
Yes.
You'd be like, why is this fool sending me a note on The Wire?
No, I need all the notes. No, you don't understand. It's like I want this dialogue. I'm inviting this.
So you've got it. I will definitely, as someone who grew up in the UK, and is from a very, I shouldn't call it a failing, but certainly a struggling nation of Sierra Leone in West Africa, where I'm originally from, I look forward to looking at this through many different lenses and talking to you about this. So I want to move on and actually pull on that thread of Baltimore and Detroit, where you're from. Both cities which are bedded in the public imagination negatively for many. Talk to me about Detroit, and a city that you are proud of and you love, and you have tried to push back on that. What do people get wrong about Detroit, where you were born?
I think, like a lot of cities in a similar position, is that because most of the times you hear about these cities, it's usually for negative reasons. When I was growing up, the only time you could count on Detroit being in the national news is when the murder rate was released, and Detroit was either number one or certainly in the top five. And the other reason was on Halloween. There was a very awful tradition in the city of Detroit for many years called Devil's Night,
What is
where
that?
so abandoned buildings and sometimes occupied buildings and homes, people set fire to at its height. That
Wow.
there might be 300 or 400 fires in the city in one night, and so it was called Devil's Night. So we
My
had
goodness.
Halloween and we had Devil's Night, and so the city would literally burn. And this was a regular part of my childhood, and because people couldn't understand why this was happening, naturally it made all the national news. And so I was caught up in this cycle as a resident there and growing up, that like, oh, people really think only bad things come from Detroit. You hear about the riots that happened in 1967. You of course hear about the just general decline, bankruptcy. When the recession hit, when the recession was very prevalent in the States back in the mid 2000s, I saw so many news stories about how in Detroit you could buy a house for $1,000, which was true. But when you're from there, there's a certain pride that you take in the city. And a lot of good things come out of Detroit. I mean, Detroit at one point, and this is why it's interesting to study it as a city, was the richest city in the world because of the auto
I did not
industry.
know that.
It
I mean,
was.
people don't talk about that. That's not the
No,
first thing they talk about when they say Detroit.
not at all. It's usually crime. It's usually something negatively related. I do think some of that has changed because the city is in a actual turnaround, which in itself brings some other deeper questions about who's benefiting from the turnaround. But I'll save that for another podcast. But it was important to me to always put on for the city because Detroit, despite its shortcomings, it was a city that very much fused to my personality. The grit that I get, the grit that I have, I should say, and the resilience, having this chip on your shoulder. This is all of the things that I got from this city because that's the texture of it. And when you grow up in
Right.
a city with this kind of texture, it prepares you for the world in ways that other places cannot. And so Detroit will always have my heart. And for me, it's important that people understand that there are residents and people there who have lived there for decades that love this city and want to see the best for it. But much like a lot of majority black cities, we have not always been put in position to make that happen, either by local leadership, state leadership, or national leadership.
The challenges of Detroit, if you want the macro, the big picture challenges of Detroit, a place where you grew up, and if you dig deeper, the challenges you faced in your own childhood, which you've been very candid about, struggles that your parents faced with addiction and other issues, you've never shied away from directly putting them out there and discussing. And I know that they are a central theme and part of your upcoming memoir that will be out shortly, Uphill. All of that, the childhood, Detroit as a whole, how did all of that play into your decision to wanting to be a journalist?
So I think when you grow up in a city that is in very many ways at least looked at as a forgotten city, as an overlooked city, as a city that doesn't deserve to have access to certain things, that doesn't deserve beautiful things. Growing up with a sense of injustice that was abound and everywhere around me made me more curious about how that injustice happened. It also made me more vigilant about seeing the accountability for that injustice. Because there's so many core tenets of journalism, but the two most important and central to journalism are truth and accountability. And I think that growing up, seeing some of the things that I was able to see, you understand that there are systems, people, circumstances at play that are meant to undermine progress. And even though I always wanted to write about sports, even in sports that people often uphold as the ultimate meritocracy, and yes, I think that's largely true. I don't think it's 100% an infallible truth. that sports is generally a meritocracy. All the problems we see show up in sports show up in wider society. One of the reasons I gravitated to sports beyond the competition part of it, beyond the fact that you were seeing extraordinary individuals do extraordinary things, was that through sports, you can actually explain the other things that were happening around the world. The difference is because sports is automatically a mechanism that draws people together, unlike other things that we have, that to me gave it a purpose to have a wider conversation about things, especially with people who might not ordinarily listen.
That's
Like
right.
there is, whether however people want to judge it, there's a difference between if Joe Biden says something versus if LeBron James says something. There's a difference, right? And
Yeah.
so understanding that difference and understanding that athletes, especially black athletes, had an ability to connect to communities differently, it was something that I kind of wanted to be a part of. In addition to the storytelling part, the ability to shape and contextualize narratives, and to, as I said, to honor truth and accountability. These were all of the things that drew me to wanting to be a journalist.
You wanted to be a part of shining a light and, as you said, contextualizing and shaping narratives. But as a black female choosing sports journalism, you may want it, but it might be a little bit of a harder pill to swallow for others. And that's putting it nicely. So you talk to me about that. I was a sportscaster. I wouldn't call myself a sports journalist. I wouldn't dare. I was a sportscaster in the UK for 3 years at Sky Sports News. And I did something a little bit like your ESPN show where, we did the results and the big stories. And let's be honest, I hated it. I did it for a job. I'm just being honest. You, no lies here. I just needed the paycheck. You did it and you loved it. But as I said, not necessarily immediately loved by all. Talk to me about the experience.
So I think what you hinted at with your own experience is pretty widely true. Is that when you're a woman, a black woman, in the sports space, sports is. I mean, I think most women enter industries that are probably male dominated. There are certainly some exceptions, but most of us have to deal with that. But there's male and then there's male. Sports is male.
Yeah. Capital M both ways. Male.
Capital M both ways, as you said, where the texture, the language, everything you're around is not just male, but it's also positioned to be anti-female.
Absolutely.
Because that's why coaches or I won't even pin this on coaches. That's why it's common language to say, oh, just put a skirt on them, or language they often use that is very decidedly against women. Because one of the core tenets of sports for male athletes and for male sports is do everything to prove you're not like women.
Yeah.
Right?
Absolutely.
And
Yeah,
so
yeah.
you're entering this space of that cocoon of maleness and patriarchy. And it could be very isolating. When I first became a columnist at the Orlando Sentinel, this was back in 2005. I was the only black female sports columnist at a daily newspaper in North America. Notice I didn't say just America, North
Wait,
America.
So how do you process that? And and does that become a part of how you do your job? A knowledge of the position you have?
It becomes a part of it both intentionally and unintentionally, because intentionally, there is a much different scrutiny for you than it is for other people. Unintentionally, it impacts you because even though I'm 1 out of 305, because that was the number of newspapers at the time in North America, there is also the burden you have to deal with of people looking at you like you don't belong there and you didn't earn your way there.
Yeah,
Even
that you're
though
a diversity pick or whatever.
that you're a diversity pick, even though on its face that is totally counter to the point they're trying to prove. Because if it was just about hiring the first black woman face that you see, then there would be more of me. I was the only one, which means I had to be exceptional to get there. But that's not the vibe that you get when you're in there, and I'm sure you can speak to that, is that every day and at every moment, all the time, you're having to prove to people, both visible and invisible, that you deserve and have earned the right to be there. And that's very exhausting because other people don't have to do that. And it begins to impact how you do your job, in the sense that if you're in this always in this mode of having to prove it and always seeking validation, it can
And it
impact
sows a seed of
how you write.
self-doubt. Yeah, and it
Correct.
seeds. It can't. No matter how confident you are, you begin to not just be the harshest critic of your own performance, but just doubt, because everyone's doubting.
Yeah, and that was why early on I always say this, and people think I'm just kidding and trying to be self-deprecating. I was like, oh, I was pretty terrible as a columnist the first 6 to 8 months. And the reason I was terrible is because I didn't have confidence in what I'm saying. The reason I didn't have confidence in what I was saying is because I was worried too much about what other people thought about what I was saying. I was worried about the fact that people were whispering that I was a diversity hire, and I let it impact the way in which I spoke to truth. Because if you can't worry about the reaction, you just have to write what it is. And so if you're thinking too much about that, it prevents you from being actually authentic. So I wasn't very authentic those first 6 to 8 months. And then finally, it just kind of got to a point where I realized that the people who didn't like me, one column wasn't going to convince them to like me or agree with me, or not even, it wasn't even about agreeing, just not thinking that I didn't deserve to be there. One column was never going to change that. That was just their ingrained thinking about a woman in my position. So once I was able to sort of clear those self-doubts out of my mind, it helped me write much, much stronger, and it helped me settle into being myself as somebody who deserve to have authoritative commentary on things.
I think that's one of the things that I've always found striking about your work, whether I'm reading it or watching it on various platforms, is the clarity of voice and the certainty of your own position. You're not saying that you've never, from what I've seen, said this is what my position is gospel or the only way to take it, but this is my position and this is where I stand. And I've always been struck by that in a world and in a country that equivocation and other sidism, both sidism is quite a thing. You have stuck to that lane of this is what I believe. And I think it's worth highlighting because it's so rare. Let's talk about sports and politics and the relationship between the two, which is uncomfortable to many people, many white people, let's be honest. They're the ones who seem to take the greatest umbrage to that connection. Your work has highlighted the intersection, the inescapable intersection. Can you speak to me about that and how you view it?
Well, as you mentioned, there is a fallacy that is told that sports and politics, and I actually don't even love using the word politics, because in many ways that trivializes what I feel like are issues that are not up for debate. Politics implies there's a pro and a con. There's not a pro and a con to racism. There's not a pro and a con to gender disparity or to many of the other things, or being anti-LGBTQ plus. There's not a debate there, okay? And so what people often overlook, or it's not even they overlook, they just practice willful ignorance, is that these issues have always collided against each other. Major League Baseball was integrated by Jackie Robinson in 1947. The Civil Rights Bill was signed into effect in 1964. That thus ended sort of segregation, right? And so you found sports being almost 20 years ahead in terms of getting people to understand,
right,
not just the need for integration, but equality. It really wasn't about integrating. It was always about equality. And so sports has been a place, and much of the reason why I love and have invested in sports, where people can see an issue that polarizing at the time and see it differently, because they had a great baseball player who suddenly was in this predominantly white league and performing at the level of or outperforming many of his peers. And so it begins to debunk myths about where people see certain people's value in our society, being able to be seen fully and wholly human in every space. And so the complete campaign to make it seem like these issues have been separate is just a lie that is based off privilege. I mean, as you said, really this argument has been mostly proliferated by white America and by white folks. And this is what their privilege allows them to do, is see sports as something separate. We have never been able to see anything that we do as separate. We simply can't. We can't divorce ourselves from being black in anything that we do. It's a part of our general condition. It's as natural to us as breathing. So when people say things to me like stick to sports, or sports shouldn't have politics, or it shouldn't involve race or gender or any queer transgender issues, what you're saying to me is I have the privilege of forgetting these things.
Absolutely.
Most of us who do not fit the white, cis, hetero normative narrative do not have that privilege. We can't wake up and be like, you know what, next couple hours, just not going to be black when I walk outside. Just not going to be doing that, knowing at any point the police might roll up on me, or if I'm in a wrong place that doesn't look like I need to be there, somebody is basically going to roll up on me and ask for my freedom papers.
Yeah,
so
absolutely.
We don't have that luxury. So that's why we see it in everything that we do. And in sports, understanding certain dynamics of sports that you have generally in this space, keeping it to black people, you have black athletes that are lauded for their talent, celebrated for their gifts, entertaining masses with what they can do. But when they leave outside that domain, they treat it like any black person
100%, yeah,
on the street. And so there's something there that is different in the public consciousness. So to act like these two things haven't been related is crazy. And maybe taxpayers haven't figured this part out yet. But if you're paying taxes in America and there's a stadium in your hometown, you paid for it. So that inherently is political. Because when the owners come to your city government and ask for money to fund their stadium, as a taxpayer, you're now involved. So just the act of having stadiums in your town or your vicinity is political. So they're never separate, ever.
I do love what you said about, the element of privilege in the mix here. People who decide that, sport is purely entertainment and separate from the rest of life. You left ESPN months after putting out, it's been well discussed, and so we're not going to go over it again, but the tweet about Donald Trump calling him a white supremacist. And then a month later, you made comments about Jerry Jones, owner of the Dallas Cowboys, after he made his comments about players kneeling during the national anthem, saying in your tweet that fans should express their displeasure by boycotting their advertisers. Eventually, you left ESPN. I know you don't regret those statements. I don't have to ask you about that. But what I do want to ask you about is, what did that episode tell you about America? Or maybe what surprised you from that whole imbroglio?
It didn't tell me anything different about America. It just further it confirmed. I think confirmation is more of the word. It's like Donald Trump is the least surprising president in American history. He is, because
do you think so? I mean, let's take a minute and say, you say least surprising. And I agree on the face of it. Maybe least surprising president, but there have been elements in terms of the number of white women who voted for him repeatedly, and how, I don't know, the elements to the Trump story that I still find surprising, but maybe that's as an outsider.
Yeah, the reason I don't is because, and this is, something that I wish and hope our conversations taking place in circles of white women. White women historically have voted for whiteness, not for gender. That is a fact. Okay, the majority of white people in America have not voted Democratic since Lyndon B. Johnson. After the Civil Rights Act came in the mid 60s, they stopped voting for Democrats because they were making an active choice as a collective body. I'm not saying every white person, but the fact is more than half did. Their active choice was we value whiteness more than we value democracy, more than we value gender, more than we value anything else. We want to protect and sustain white privilege. That's what we're voting for. So when you look at the historical trends, Donald Trump is literally the least surprising president ever. The only reason it was so shocking is because of what came before it. Because you had the first black president in American history who was, credential-wise, this man had to be perfect in every single way.
Single way.
Yeah, I mean, based off educational achievements. Then you look at his family and Michelle Obama being the most educated first lady in history. You have this, no scandal, all of these things that had to check the smell test for a Barack Obama to happen. Every time in American history, there has been tremendous progress. Whenever there's been a hint that there is about to be a change, there has been tremendous backlash. That's how we went from Reconstruction to Jim Crow.
Absolutely.
It was the same principle, right? And so with Donald Trump, to borrow what a friend of mine, Ta-Nehisi Coates, has said, and he wrote it brilliantly in his essay for The Atlantic, is that Donald Trump was about proving that he could be the least and still get to the same place that somebody black had to be the most to get to. That was the whole experiment with that. And when you look at what Donald Trump stood for and what he campaigned off of and what the buy-in has been, these were all things that were very prevalent in the conservative Republican Party long before Donald Trump. There was a guy named Ronald Reagan who basically ran a similar campaign, but he was nicer. But he was the one who even coined the phrase, "Make America Great Again." So there's always nothing new under the sun, which is the value of history. So when I call him the least surprising president ever, when you look at how he was elected, why people voted for him,
and why people voted for him again. After we've seen 4 years of him. Why did they vote for him again?
Yes, they were just like, sign me up for more, right? And even white women were like, hey, more of that. Okay. So when you look at all of these different factors, it's actually not that surprising. I think it was just stunning in the moment to a lot of us. And I'm not saying that I wasn't a part of that group, because there were at least certain elements of decorum I thought would still stay in place.
Agreed.
And they didn't. And those safeguards, when they were removed, I had to think about it and say, you know what? I get it. I understand why he was able to get there. And more importantly, the stain that he's left on our democracy, we will not be under for decades. We may not, I hate to sound like a pessimist. We may never get from up under this. We might not, because looking at these midterm elections that are coming up, I'm not very hopeful, because I just think that he left such a permanent stain on American politics. I just don't know if there's enough people in place to deviate us going right into the iceberg, so to speak.
I mean, I think he left a stain on politics, on discourse, he he poisoned the well in a way that I just don't know. I'm with you. I don't know if we can purify again in our lifetimes, and how he has. I think the most fascinating thing about Trump I use that. Yes, fascinating, is the way he gaslights us and flips narrative. And when you try and hold him to any kind of standard or decorum, it becomes, you're silencing me, it's the liberal media. It's fascinating to see in real time how it plays out, which brings me to something else which I need you to weigh in on, because it's a similar kind of sentiment that has been expressed in recent days. Kanye West, same kind of I'm being silenced for expressing my opinions because my opinions don't jive with liberal media. What do you make of the Kanye mess? Let's just call it that. Or the Ye mess, whatever he is called these days.
What I make of it is that somebody who's a narcissist at heart and that is attached to, clearly, as he has publicly said, that he is suffering from some mental illness issues, on top of a media who is keen to exploit that and the talking points, the white supremacist talking points that he seems to be espousing, that it not seems to be, is espousing, on top of the misinformation and all those other things. So it's a collective mess of a very perfectly designed cocktail. And I have no sympathy for Kanye West, like zero.
None.
And
you don't have any.
None. I don't have any, because while I am sensitive to people who are certainly have mental health issues, everybody I know dealing with the same issues does not immediately use those issues to veer toward the playbook of white supremacy. Like, that's not a byproduct of being someone suffering from mental health challenges. So for him to make that leap is purposeful, it's willful, and it's intentional. And so I'm not seeing any of this as a mistake, because I do think that...
So you think it's his truth?
Well, truth is a strong word, but what I will say is that I think it's a part of his overall narrative, which has been there for some time now, is that Kanye West wants to feel important and be validated by people who, frankly, are not people who typically want to be in on our issues or in our community, that don't have our community in their best interest. So the validation he's seeking is not from black people. Black people validated him a long time ago. Black people have supported him his entire career.
Black people have built a great amount of his wealth.
Exactly. So it's not us he's putting on this dog and pony show for, because if it was, there wouldn't be a dog and pony show for it, because our love for him up until this point has usually been pure and unconditional. So he's seeking something else that we can't give him. What he doesn't understand is that what he's seeking is only going to destroy him. And when he tries to come back to the people who have held him down, it's going to be a lonely path, because we're not going to be there. At the end of the day,
Black
regardless
people, we're forgiving, though. We're forgiving.
We are
people,
very
though.
forgiving. And you're right. And I think that's part of the part that we have to assess. We're generally by nature a protectionist community.
That's
we
right.
know that we innately, while we're not a monolith, without you and I even having a conversation about it, like a full, deep conversation, you telling me about your experience with Sky News, I can already relate to. And you haven't even told me one incident, right? So we have a shared experience that we all innately understand that we're going through. And because of that, whenever we see a black person who we feel like is being unnecessarily torn down, who's being put in the crosshairs, who's being jumped on by the white establishment, we automatically, off instinct, extend our protectionism, the part that we have to learn as a community. And I bring this up every time that we want to talk about the fact that, if you're talking about the Jewish community or the queer community, that there's a hardline stance that's drawn.
Yeah.
And I say the reason why is because they drew it as a community. We do not do that. And because we so want to be forgiving and we want to allow people to have their space, Kanye been on these talking points for a minute. And we were still buying his shoes. So we told people with our actions that what he was saying about us was okay.
Totally.
We didn't draw a line. That does not happen in other communities where a line is drawn with their own people and it's not tolerated. And because of that, everybody else acts accordingly. We ain't set the standard. So because as long as that's the case, then that's why he could get on Tucker Carlson and he could get on these other shows and he can specifically parrot anti-black talking points and nobody will check him about it, that they think it's okay to air. That's why. That's part of the reason why. It's not solely on us, but like we as a community need to be able to hold our people accountable without feeling like there's shame in that. Because it's really not. It's about saying like, hey, just like you would in a personal relationship, this is my expectation of treatment. When you violate this expectation, the consequence is I'm not going to be here for you.
Yeah, you don't have access to me anymore.
You don't have access to me, and that's it. And we have to be fine with that and walk away with some folks. And that is a part where we have struggled to do or have learned the hard way to the point where it has undermined bigger things that we're trying to accomplish.
And listen, it's not just Kanye. We can talk about R. Kelly. We can talk about Bill Cosby.
It's a long
list of people that we just don't have a point of no return, where there's still the sense of, oh, we got to give them cover. But to the Kanye point, I don't see people. Well, let me phrase it more accurately. I don't see white America saying. I don't see much of the loud commentators and the people who, I don't see them shouting, shut up and just sing, shut up and just entertain us in the way for black athletes. It is shut up and stick to sports. Is there a reason?
No, there's a very identifiable reason, is that whenever you are on brand with what a white establishment talking point is, you will not be told to shut up. You will be further encouraged. And so Kanye, his the fuel on him is not going to run out until he says something against them that they don't like. And then the fuel runs out, right? He can, as anyone knows, like there's a great amount of currency to be gained by being anti-black, whether you're black, white, like there's a great amount of currency that's there and available. And as long as he stays on message, he's going to get that validation that he clearly desperately needs. And that's kind of the worrisome part, is because we do not know how far this is going to go. And my suspicion is just that he's going to reach a point where it's going to go too far. And then once it goes too far, then he's going to want us to embrace him. I'm off that train. If other people want to involve themselves and put yourself through that kind of mental exhaustion, that's on you. But I just hope black people know he does not deserve us.
No room
Period.
at the Jemele Hill Inn.
None.
There's no room here. It's
Doors
done.
closed.
Doors closed.
Occupancy full.
But let me ask you, is the silencing of black athletes, is that still as prevalent in your view? Is it still as virulent in your view?
It absolutely is. And I think the nuanced part of that in examining, how black athletes are able to use their voice, you have to look at what they're talking about, what league it is, and what are the financial implications. I still do think a great many athletes are concerned that if they do speak out, it will jeopardize their financial futures. And I think that's a real concern that they have. And some of it depends on what you're talking about. Like, an athlete can give to charity all day long. They don't mind them cutting a check at all, because that's just an act of like, we're cutting a check. There's no voice behind it, right? Which is why the NFL has tried desperately to shift the conversation and the action into giving money. Because when you start speaking about conditions, that's where the threat is. People, again, this is why I love, among the many reasons I love studying history, is because everything that's happened is just a repeat or a updated version of what we've seen before. When it was during the civil rights movement, the active, suppressive part of the government was about shutting down entertainment. That's why they gave, Billie Holiday so much hell. They gave her hell over a song. A song, Strange Fruit. They ruined this woman's life because she had the nerve to, in a song, bring the attention, the much needed attention to lynching and how black people were dehumanized and brutalized in this country. A song. This is why taking a knee is powerful. Gestures always ring differently. That's not to say that movements and causes should not be financially supported. Of course they should. What they don't want you to do is influence.
Yes.
Is use your influence. The reason Colin Kaepernick is not with the NFL has nothing to do with his ability to play, has everything to do with his ability to lead. They do not want somebody like that in a NFL locker room where they're trying to preach conformity, listening to your owner and your coach. And here you have someone who stepped outside all of those systems to make sure that people understood the conditions in which black people were living in. They do not want that. And so it's the influence of what these gestures create, where suddenly you have players and people asking different kinds of questions, holding them accountable in different kinds of ways, and they don't want that. So that is why black athletes are silenced.
Yeah.
And I think the reason they went as far as they did to make an example of someone like Colin Kaepernick is so the rest of them could see this is what waits for you if you dare publicly challenge us.
And to that point, actually, about that, it is quite clear. I asked the question, are they still being silenced? If they weren't being silenced, Colin Kaepernick would be playing.
That was the other thing, too, is that, one of the more disappointing aspects was that the players didn't stand with him. Some players did, but as a body, they should have stood with him.
And why is that? Why is there such an acute difference between the NFL? Again, I speak as a transplant here, but it's something that I've asked people before. No one can give me a good answer. I see a difference in organizing and a willingness to speak out. I see a difference, and willingness to speak out on social justice issues. I see a difference between the NBA, WNBA, and the NFL.
It is a difference.
Why?
Okay, so let's take the WNBA, for example. You're dealing with female athletes who have had to fight for respect and equity at every turn in their career, at every level. That's all they've done. So this is their fight, that they know it and they know it well. All right, you dealing with tried and true soldiers since elementary school, since whenever they started playing. They've had to deal with inconsistent, unfair, inequitable treatment. They're used to speaking up. It's their love language because they have to do it all the time. You get to the NBA. The NBA is a players' league, financially structured to be a players' league. One player can change the entire fortune of a franchise. When you have players individually who are able to wield so much power, they're more empowered to speak their truth. It also helps when your best players in the league are also your most vocal players. LeBron James is very vocal. He makes the most money.
All of these people. Yeah.
Steph Curry, they're all very vocal because they've changed the entire complexion of cities by themselves, franchises. They've made people billionaires several times over. They've made cities have influxes of millions in cash by their very presence, and they're very aware of that power, and they use it. The NFL is a sport of conformity. Football, by its nature, is. You have to have all players understanding that they have to sacrifice something that's bigger than them. Their bodies, their mental health, all of that needs to be sacrificed for betterment of team and franchise. This is embedded in them at the very beginning, that you have to cope with very serious injuries. They often say in the league, there's a difference between being hurt and being injured. Mm-hmm. They believe in that mantra very deeply. And so because of their penchant toward conformity, it shows up when it comes to addressing bigger issues. The NFL career lifespan is not very long. It's an average of 3 to 5 years. They have a very limited, finite window to make money and to be a professional. They're very aware of that. The owners use that to their advantage. There's not fully guaranteed contracts across the board in the NFL. Certain players are able to negotiate it. It is not it's not a given for every player like it is in the NBA. So because of the financial leverage that the owners have over them, that makes them much more reluctant to
Right.
join in on causes that could jeopardize the limited window that they feel like that they have in the NFL.
You may not be at ESPN anymore, but you continue to use your platform to write about these issues, to talk about these issues, these inequities, these structural discrimination that exists. Why is that so important to you? Why do you continue to use your voice in this way?
Well, I do think, I guess going back to when I made the decision to be a journalist, I'm not saying journalism is the only profession in which you feel as if your personality fuses with what are the core beliefs in that profession, but it's one of the highest where you do. I mean, I decided to do this under the assumption I would be broke because the idea of journalists making money was just completely foreign when I was coming up. And when I graduated from college, I remember very distinctly that based off Newsweek's reports of highest salaries by profession, journalists, the average salary was $19,000 per year. And I still did this anyway, right? That's pretty shameful. When I was in college, I freelanced for a paper called the Lansing State Journal. I was making $30 a story. And I still love this profession as much then as I do now, even knowing $30 a story. I thought I would be doing good if I ever made $50,000 a year. Mm-hmm. And I say all this to say is that I was committed to a bigger ideal. I think most people who speak up about injustice, who want to be a voice, who are active and on the front lines, is because you're believing and walking by faith that you can make something better. And as corny as hokey as it sounds, you have to believe in the promise of something. If you don't believe in the promise of it, it's sort of like, why are you here? With this country in particular, I think Black people are the greatest examples of that. When you look at our track record in terms of wanting to fight in world wars, wanting to be on the front lines for American freedom, the reason why so many of us believe in it, despite the fact that it's never fully been proven that they want to give us complete access to it, and given the way that we were brought to this country, is because we have that hope in something better. We believe the brochure of America. The brochure of America says that we deserve equality, freedom, and liberation. We bought it. And we are the reason that we're going to hold America to it. I mean, Nicole Hannah-Jones, who, as you know, was the architect behind the 1619 Project, she said something in an interview to me that I've never forgotten. And she said that Black people are the most inconvenient people in this country. We're inconvenient because we actually are going to hold America to what they said. That those pretty phrases on the Statue of Liberty about give me your sick, give me your tired, give me your poor, we actually believe that. And we're going to hold you to it. So you said you wanted to be this. And, if it's anything, Black people going to remind you about what you said. Okay.
Again and again.
We're going to bring the receipts. We're going to bring the receipts. The receipt is, you see this Constitution? You see what you put on the Statue of Liberty? You see what you promised us in the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments? Here are the receipts. We're waiting. And we're going to, if we have to, drag this country to being its best self because we've invested too much in building it to desert it. And so I very much fall into that line of thinking, despite at times when moments where I wake up and say, I am in an abusive relationship with a country right now. Despite those moments we all have, like, this place is just going to burn up. Like, what is happening? But I believe that there is promise that will be there that's worth fighting for. And it would be disrespectful to our ancestors, to me, to not believe in it, because I'm living a much better life than somebody like Harriet Tubman could have ever imagined.
Yeah.
And if Harriet never got tired, what the hell do I look like? She ain't get tired. What do I look like getting tired? I don't, and I have much more resources than her.
That. Yeah. That's what Jesse Williams says all the time. Like, how dare you even begin to talk about being tired, when you think about what our ancestors went through to start the progress that this country continues to fight for. Where do you stand in relation to activism when you talk about that hope and that fight? Where do you stand in relation to that? Because as a journalist, but sometimes I've heard you describe yourself as a former journalist. I was laughing to myself last night. I was like, she's a lapsed journalist.
I play a journalism like here and there, but no, this is the way that I had to see it. I had to see journalism as activism. And I know people have it in their mind thinking that journalists are supposed to be fair and accurate. Objectivity to me is the downfall of journalism. Objectivity means that everything deserves a counter argument and everything does not. Everything doesn't deserve both sides. The whole essential component of journalism is truth. And the truth is going to point to one direction sometimes. And we have to be okay with accepting that. So the work to me is the activism, right? Because when I was coming up, in journalism school and just listening to how other journalists were giving me tips and tools in terms of how to conduct myself as a journalist, there was a couple themes that definitely popped up in journalism textbooks. Journalists are supposed to be the watchdogs of society. If you're a watchdog, you're not neutral. You know why? Because you're going to bite somebody who's stepping out of line, right? Okay, that's part of the deal. So this whole, you got to be objective, I was like, that's not in the language of what we learned from the Hearst brothers and other great prominent journalists that were integral in starting the free press. Ida B. Wells was not objective. Lynching was wrong, and she wrote about it. And she brought to our forefront the horrors of lynching and what this was doing to Black communities and how Black communities were being terrorized. That's not an objective position. It's the truth. So this whole idea that we shouldn't say anything and we should stay out of it is a lie. It's our job to be involved. It's the old phrase that all journalists know. Our job is to comfort the afflicted and afflict the comfortable. That's what it is. That's not an objective position. So through that is where the activism lies. People have tried to convince the populace, especially as it relates to journalism, that activism is a naughty word or a dirty word, and journalism shouldn't be connected to activism. And I choose to now look at it differently and say, well, if we're not being active in challenging power structures, authority, holding them accountable, what are we here for? We're literally abandoning the whole reason why many of us did this.
Agreed. You take this pursuit of truth and now you transport it, transplant it to a memoir. Why? Because this is not an easy. This is not an easy one. Why do this? Why put your truth out there and open yourself up to everything that comes with it?
Well, originally, I did not want to do this. At my heart of hearts, despite the fact that this memoir is out, I wanted to be a fiction writer. I still want to be a fiction writer, and I still will be a fiction writer. Let me say that in the affirmative. And the motivation behind doing it initially was the fact that the money was there, to be honest.
Listen,
I mean,
no
it
lies
was.
here. So I love
No
it.
lies.
No lies
it
here.
was. It was. And once my literary agent, David Larrabell, convinced me that, you have to tell your story, and this book is going to go to auction, which means it'll get bid on. But he said something to me that made a lot of sense in convincing me to do this. And that was that as a journalist, I know how important narratives are. I know how important context is. I very much understand how these are two dynamic parts to how stories get told or not told at all. And as he said to me, don't you want to be in control of your own story? You don't want someone else to tell this story, and especially given what your profession is, what your life's work is, you absolutely don't. So why would you leave that in the hands of somebody else? And he was right. It's like, yeah, you're right. I don't want anybody else telling this story but me. And given some of the sensitive topics I discuss, the depth of vulnerability in this book, I could not ever leave that in somebody else's hands. So while initially I had to get dragged into this process, I'm so happy that I was able to be pulled into it, because it's been exhilarating, rewarding, challenging, emotional, all those things. But all of that was worth it.
Two final questions for you before I let you go, because I know that there's a lot going on, particularly when you have a book that's just out. There's a lot to do. What will surprise people from reading this book? What do you think?
I think most people know me in the commentary space at this point. They know me as a journalist. They know me as somebody who used to be at ESPN. They know me as somebody who once got in the crosshairs of the president. They know me from speaking up on a lot of the issues you and I have discussed throughout this podcast. They have no idea how I got here, what happened, a lot of the unpleasant things I had to experience in my childhood, some of the personal challenges that I had growing into the role that I'm in now. All of this didn't come out of nowhere. It wasn't like I just woke up and I was suddenly at ESPN. There was a long, arduous, exhausting path that led to that. And so I think they're going to be surprised by my background. And one of the reasons why I thought it was important, once I was on this process to write a book, important to be as transparent as possible, is that I realize there's a lot of shame over certain issues that a lot of us experience. We have it in our mind what a victim looks like, what a survivor looks like, what, somebody who has had the experience of having, addicts as parents, which I did. I talked about my abortion in this book because we have it in our mind about who gets an abortion and who has access to an abortion and who deserves.
And what's a legitimate reason to have an abortion?
And what's a legitimate reason?
Yeah.
Exactly. So we have all these preconceived notions, not understanding that in your circle of friends, somebody's probably had an abortion or somebody's paid for one. It's very close to you. All these things that you tend to judge and have these very strong opinions about from far away. There are people in your circle hiding things from you because they perceive that you're not someone they can talk to about these things. And so I believe transparency creates empathy. And by sharing so much of what I've lived through and what I've experienced, I'm hoping to create empathy for the people who are not in my position and who do not have a platform or, a celebrity profile, so to speak. Because if you can create empathy for me based off what you think I've experienced, you should do it for your neighbor. You should do it for that girl you went to school with, or that ex-girlfriend you had, or boyfriend, or whatever is your circumstance. You should be able to do the same thing for them. And so that's why, as I got into the process, it became really important to me to tell the story a very specific way.
I think one of my greatest takeaways from reading about you and spending time thinking about your journey is that you, from the leaving of ESPN to the starting of, Unbothered, your podcast, to the creation of the podcast network, to this memoir that's now out, you have shown you've demonstrated your understanding and your embracing of your own voice and your own power. And I know that that's not something that happened overnight. It's never that way. But what do you say to other women, particularly Black women, who are struggling with owning their voice and their power? I saw something where you said something like, I think it was before 2020, going into 2022, you were like, next year I'm embracing my, being an entrepreneur. That's where I'm going, like, you're embracing your power. What do you say to other women who are not quite there yet?
What I would say is that be kind and gentle to yourself, because I think we do have a tendency to feel like we should have so much figured out when we're still in the learning and ideating phase. The voice I have now is not the voice I had in my 20s. It's not the voice I even had in my 30s. It's not the voice I had 5 years ago. And so if you understand that it's not supposed to be a finite moment where you say, oh, I got my voice, here it is. It's actually, you're adding to your voice all the time based off what you've experienced, based off how you are able to create newer boundaries. You're like in real time, your development is happening. So you can't ever put this unrealistic expectation on yourself is that you're going to wake up one day, have it all figured out, have a voice, be able to project that, be able to, in white spaces, check people who need to be checked. You will have to go through some things. You will have to lose some battles. You will have to, as I like to call it, let some fish swim by, meaning that there's going to be some that you don't even pick up until you get to a point where you have enough leverage, enough confidence, enough lived experience to say, now I've gotten to the point where my default mentality is what you not going to do is. When you get there, you will know it, okay? Because the things that used to bother you won't bother you anymore. And for that matter, you won't always be living for other people's validation or their acceptance. And so I reached that point in part because of some of the things I went through at ESPN, to where I realized that good soldier is only going to work for so long. Mm-hmm. And then at some point you have to be a mercenary. And so now I'm in the mercenary phase of my career and it feels, it feels good. And understanding that the added responsibility that you carry is that when you get to that point of being unbothered, to borrow off the name of my podcast in the network, for Black women I'm creating with Spotify, is like when you actually reach that point, you will go harder because it's not just about you. You're trying to lay a forged path for every woman, every Black woman behind you, every Black person behind you. Like, oh, okay, if I light them up enough, the next time another Black person comes through who doesn't have my agency, they'll think twice. So now I'm just like, there were points in my career where it was about getting through the door. I'm past that. I'm kicking through the door. And when I come in there, if I'm the only one in there that looks like me, the whole room got to go. Mm-hmm. The whole room got to go. I can't be in here as the only one. And I am not your Negro Vance. Like Bagger Vance, I'm not Negro Vance. Like I'm not in here to kindly walk white people through the ways of like understanding institutional racism. I'm not hand holding. I'm not doing none of that. Right? At this point, we got enough information. We've had enough of these talks where any reason on your part to not do better in terms of inclusion or diversity or just seeking us out, period, is willful. You already know what the problem is. I can't handhold you through everything. You got to bring something to the table that lets me know you're committed. I am not here to be your wise and spiritual Negro. I'm here to hold you accountable for the things that you said that you were going to do. That is my role. Because it's not about me, but as I said, it's about every Black person that comes through this door after me.
Jemele Hill is not your Negro Yoda.
I am not your Negro Yoda. Not here. Not here for that. I am not your Negro whisperer. Like none of that. That's not me. That's too exhausting. It's like
the wrong one.
You got the wrong one. Stop asking Black people to do that. Like no, we done. We done with that.
On those wise words, we're going to leave it there. But Jemele, I just want to say thank you. Thank you again for the clarity, for the courage, and for inspiring so many of us. It was such a pleasure speaking to you today. And congratulations on the book, which I thought was coming out October 25th, but it's already out now. You can pre-order, get out there, get it, and let's support. So Jemele Hill, thank you.
Thank you for everything. I appreciated the conversation.